Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I wasn't planning to stay long in Red Haven, Wisconsin. It was supposed to be a temporary gig while I figured out my next move after my wife left me. But the thing about small towns like Red Haven is that they have a way of pulling you in, wrapping you up in their traditions and secrets before you even realize it. I arrived in early September, just as the town was gearing up for its annual Harvest Moon Festival. It seemed harmless enough at first. Every shopfront had some sort of fall display: hay bales, pumpkins, scarecrows with stitched-on smiles. The town square was bustling with preparations. Kids stringing up orange and black bunting, elderly women knitting scarves for the craft stall, and farmers hauling wagons of corn to be stacked for the corn maze. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of wood smoke and freshly baked pies. It was the kind of postcard-perfect place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Or so I thought. I'd been the sheriff of Red Haven for about 6 months when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. I was organizing old case files in the back room of the station, clearing out decades of dust and neglect. That's when I noticed the dates: 1894, 1901, 1908, 1915, every 7 years, like clockwork. Each file was marked with a red M in the corner. A note from one of my predecessors. Missing persons. No bodies, no evidence. Just peoplemen, women, even kids who disappeared without a trace. And the strangest part? They all vanished during the Harvest Moon Festival. It couldn't be a coincidence. I spent the next few days digging through old newspapers and asking subtle questions around town. Most folks didn't seem to know or pretended not to know anything unusual about the festival. They spoke of it fondly, like it was the heart and soul of the community. But then there was Earl Granger. Earl was a recluse, the kind of old man kids dared each other to visit on Halloween. I caught him outside his dilapidated barn one evening and brought up the disappearances. His face went pale, and he muttered something about the old ways before spitting on the ground and limping back inside. By the time the festival kicked off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The parade, the pie-eating contests, the carnival game sit all felt like a distraction, like a shiny surface hiding something rotten underneath. The centerpiece of the festival was the corn maze. It stretched over several acres of farmland on the outskirts of town, its towering stalks forming a labyrinth that was supposed to be good fun for families. But as I stood at the entrance that night, staring at the flickering lanterns lining the paths, my gut told me to stay away. "Come on, Dad," my daughter Clara called out, tugging on my hand. She was the only reason I'd stuck around Red Haven as long as I had. Her mom had left us both, and I couldn't bear to uproot her again so soon. Reluctantly, I followed her into the maze. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The cheerful laughter and chatter of other festival goers seemed to vanish, swallowed up by the thick walls of corn. Even Clara, who was usually full of energy, stayed close to my side, her small hand gripping mine tightly. And then we saw them. At first, I thought they were just scarecrows. They stood at the edges of the paths, their burlap faces stitched into crooked grins, their straw-stuffed arms outstretched as if to guide us. But as we passed one, I could have sworn its head turned slightly to follow us. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Clara. "See what?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't want to scare her, but my heart was pounding. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my paranoia get the better of me. But then we came to a dead end, and one of the scarecrows stepped down from its post. I don't remember much about how we got out of the maze. All I know is that we ran, crashing through the corn like wild animals. I carried Clara in my arms, her terrified screams echoing in my ears, but the scarecrows were too fast. Eventually, they caught us and dragged us through a hidden trapdoor in the ground. Beneath the farmland was a cavernous chamber lit by torches, the walls covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. A group of townsfolk stood in a circle, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. At the center of the chamber was an altar, and on it lay a young woman, bound and gagged. Her eyes met mine, pleading for help. But before I could do anything, a man stepped forward, a man I recognized as Mayor Harlan. "This is the price we pay," he said, his voice steady and cold. "The soil must be fed. I don't know how I found the strength to fight. Maybe it was the thought of losing Clara, of her ending up on that altar next. Somehow, I managed to break free, taking down one of the scarecrows with a well-placed blow to its burlap face. To my horror, beneath the mask was not straw but rotting flesh, something that had once been human. In the chaos, I grabbed Clara and ran. The last thing I remember is the blood moon hanging high in the sky, its crimson light bathing the fields as the chanting grew louder behind us. The next morning I woke up in my truck on the outskirts of town. Clara was asleep beside me, unharmed but deeply shaken. I drove straight to the next county and never looked back. I don't know what happened to Red Haven after that. I don't know if the festival continued, if the disappearances ever stopped. All I know is that something ancient and evil had its roots in that town, and I was lucky to get out alive. Even now, decades later, I still can't look at a scarecrow without feeling a chill run down my spine. And every 7 years, when the harvest moon rises, I wonder if someone else is out there, running through the corn, praying to make it out before it's too late. You might want to keep the lights on for this next one. It's even more chilling. My name's Danny Moore, and in the fall of 1978, I was desperate for work. I'd just dropped out of community college, couldn't hold down a steady job, and my mom's patience was running thin. One evening, I came across a notice pinned up at a local diner. Night security guard needed. 5 hour. Call for details. $5 an hour was decent money back then, especially for a job that only required me to sit in a chair and make sure no vandals broke into an abandoned building. I dialed the number and got an interview the next day. The job was at the old Brookfield Psychiatric Hospital, a place I'd driven past dozens of times as a kid, but never thought much about. It had been shuttered since the late 1940s after some vague scandal. The guy who hired me, Mr. Carter, didn't explain much, just that the property needed someone on site at night because kids like to sneak in and break stuff. When I asked why the last guard quit, Carter just laughed and said, "Guess he couldn't handle the boredom." I showed up at 9 p.m., flashlight in hand, and a thermos of coffee tucked under my arm. The place was massive, 5 stories tall, with broken windows, ivy creeping up the brick walls, and a rusted chain-link fence surrounding the property. Inside it was worse. The air was damp, and everything smelled of mildew and rot. Most of the furniture was gone, but there were still old wheelchairs and rusted gurneys scattered around. My office was in the main lobby, where a desk and chair had been set up. There was also a landline phone in case of emergencies. The first few hours passed quietly. I walked the halls, shining my flashlight into rooms filled with peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. Around midnight, I decided to check out the West Wing. It had been sealed off with heavy wooden boards, but there was a small gap where someone had pried them loose. As I approached, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. The tapping stopped. The next night, I came back, determined to ignore whatever weird noises I might hear. The pay was good, and I couldn't afford to quit. Around 11 p.m., I was sitting at the desk when I noticed a file folder lying on the floor. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, and the label read Patient Records West Wing. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open and skimmed through pages of faded typewriter text. Most of it was mundane, but then I saw a note dated October 31st, 1946. All patients in West Wing transferred. No further records available. The word transferred was underlined twice. There was no explanation of where they went or why. I didn't have much time to think about it because, at that moment, I heard something, a dragging sound, like heavy footsteps scraping along the tile floor. By the third night, I was on edge. I'd barely slept, and every creak and groan of the old building made my skin crawl. I decided to explore the basement. Carter hadn't mentioned it, but I'd seen a door near the stairwell marked maintenance. It took some effort to jimmy it open, but eventually I was inside. The air down there was colder, and the smell was almost unbearable, like something had died and been left to rot for decades. The light from my flashlight caught something on the floor. Scratches, deep and jagged, leading toward another door. This one was reinforced with steel and had a small observation window. I peered inside and saw cages, rows of them, stacked floor to ceiling. Most were empty, but some had objects inside: shredded hospital gowns, broken bones, and what looked like human teeth. On my fourth night, I didn't want to go back, but Carter insisted. "You're imagining things," he said. "Do your job, and you'll get your paycheck." By midnight, I was sitting at the desk, trying not to think about the basement or the strange noises. That's when I heard a voice. It was faint but unmistakable, someone whispering my name. "Danny." My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from the West Wing. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the boarded-up corridor. As I approached, I saw something move, a shadow, tall and thin, darting just out of view. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices, chanting something I couldn't understand. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. The boards covering the West Wing weren't just pried open, they were shredded, as if something had clawed its way through. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was human, or it had been. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were hollow sockets. It moved unnaturally, limbs jerking like a marionette. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I never went back to Brookfield Psychiatric. I didn't even collect my paycheck. A week later, I saw a small article in the local paper. "Security guard missing at abandoned asylum." Apparently, the guy who replaced me lasted only one night. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination, or maybe those old patient records were right. Maybe not everyone from the West Wing was transferred. I still dream about that place sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing whispers and footsteps that aren't really there. Or at least, I hope they're not. If you thought the last story was eerie, just wait until you hear this one. I grew up in a small Kentucky town, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and secrets were hard to keep. Back in the summer of 1965, the biggest draw for kids like me was the old swimming hole at Miller's Lake. It wasn't really a lake, it was more like a big, murky pit carved out from when the coal company abandoned the mine shafts decades ago. When the rain came one year, the whole thing flooded, and just like that, we had ourselves a lake. The water was always cool, even in the sticky heat of summer, and no one cared that it was brownish green. It was ours. I was 16 then, just starting to feel like I knew everything. Me and my buddies, Danny and Rob, used to ride our bikes down there every weekend. Sometimes we'd see the older kids from the high school hanging out by the deeper end, where the water was clear enough to dive in. That summer, the story started. At first, they were the usual small-town ghost tales. Someone's cousin's cousin swore they saw shadows moving beneath the water. Another kid said he felt something brush his leg. Then, the Phillips boy Tomanever came back from a midnight swim. People said he drowned, but they never found the body. His mama put up missing posters all over town, but after a few weeks, everyone moved on. Except the lake felt different after that. One August evening, Danny, Rob, and I decided to sneak out and go for a swim. The moon was full, casting a silvery light over the water. The air was thick with the chirp of crickets, and the lake looked peaceful, almost inviting. "You think Tommy's still down there?" Danny joked as we peeled off our shirts. "Shut up," Rob said, shoving him. "Don't be a chicken." I laughed, but deep down, I didn't like talking about Tommy. We waded in, the water shockingly cold against our skin. The deeper we went, the quieter the night seemed to become. The crickets faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. I was about waist deep when I noticed something, a faint shimmer below the surface. It looked like a light, flickering like a candle, but it was coming from deep down. "Hey, you guys see that?" I asked, pointing. Rob squinted. "Probably just moonlight reflecting." "No," Danny said, his voice shaking. "It's moving." The three of us stared as the light grew brighter, almost golden. For a moment, I thought I could see shapes, buildings, streets, even what looked like a church steeple. It was like an entire town was sitting beneath the water, frozen in time. "What the hell?" Rob whispered. None of us moved. We just stood there, too stunned to do anything but watch. Then, without warning, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly, but it felt like a cold, slimy hand clamping down hard. Danny and Rob rushed over, pulling me back toward the shore. Whatever it was let go just as my foot hit solid ground. We didn't say a word as we scrambled out of the water, panting and shivering. "That was not a fish," I finally managed to choke out. Danny shook his head, his face pale. "No way." Rob just stared at the lake, his jaw clenched. The next day, we told Sheriff Reed. He was an old-timer, the kind of guy who'd seen it all and didn't scare easy. But when we mentioned the glowing town under the water, his expression changed. "You boys stay away from that lake," he said, his voice low. "Why?" Danny asked. The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something about old stories and walked away. It wasn't until a week later that we learned what he meant. That Friday, the high school football team decided to have their annual end-of-summer party at the lake. They brought beer, music, and a whole lot of bravado. Around midnight, someone dared them to go for a swim. The next morning, the town woke up to a terrible silence. Not one of those boys came home. The sheriff led a search party, but they found nothing. No footprints, no clothes, no bodies. Just a football floating near the shore. The whole town was in shock. But there was something unspoken in the air, a shared knowledge that no one wanted to admit. The lake had taken them, just like it had taken Tommy. I couldn't shake the feeling that the sheriff knew more than he was letting on. So one night, I snuck into the records room at the courthouse. It was dusty and cramped, filled with old files no one had touched in years. That's where I found Ida newspaper clipping from 1920. "Tragedy Strikes Hollow Creek" was the headline. The article talked about a flood that had destroyed the original town where the lake now stood. But it wasn't just water that drowned those people. There were whispers of a ritual gone wrong, a desperate attempt by the townsfolk to summon something to save them from the rising waters. It didn't work. Instead, they unleashed something else, something that demanded sacrifices. The town had rebuilt itself further uphill, but the lake remained a dark, gaping wound filled with secrets. I've never gone back to Miller's Lake, not since that night in '65. But every now and then, I hear about another kid who goes missing there. They say the water is cursed, that the spirits of the drowned town pull people down to join them. Maybe it's true, or maybe it's just a story we tell to keep ourselves from looking too closely at the things we don't understand. All I know is this: when the moon is full and the water glows, you stay away, because some mysteries are better left unsolved. And Miller's Lake is one of them. The darkness hides many secrets, and the next tale reveals one of its most sinister. You know that feeling when the world is blanketed in snow and everything goes quiet, like the whole planet is holding its breath? That was my life in the winter of 1983. I had taken a seasonal position as a park ranger in Colorado, stationed at a remote outpost high in the Rockies. I figured it would be peaceful, a break from the constant buzz of city life. Just me, the snow, and the occasional wildlife. The job sounded simple enough. Monitor the weather, record any signs of avalanche activity, and respond to emergencies. But honestly, emergencies were rare. Most of the time, it was just me and the radio. The outpost itself was old, built sometime in the 1940s, and perched on the edge of a sheer drop into a pine forest. The station had everything I needed: bunk room, kitchen, wood stove, but it also had that feeling. You know the one, like you're not entirely alone. I chalked it up to the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood, the groans of old beams settling under the weight of snow. At least, at first, the blizzard hit on my third week there. It came out of nowhere, as storms tend to do in the mountains. By nightfall, the world outside had disappeared into a white void. I made my rounds, checking the cabin's stability, then settled by the radio to pass the time. That's when I heard it. A faint crackle, followed by a voice. "Help! Anyone there?" My stomach tightened. I adjusted the frequency, thinking maybe a nearby hiker had gotten caught in the storm. "This is Ranger Post 37. Do you copy?" "Over," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Silence. Then, after a long pause, "Please. It's so cold. I don't know where I am." The voice was faint, barely audible over the static, but it sounded desperate. It was a man's voice, quivering, like he was struggling to stay conscious. I asked for his location, but all I got back was more static. The next morning, the storm hadn't let up. I tried to radio for backup, but my signal couldn't get through the thick snow. I reviewed the station's records to see if there had been any reports of missing hikers in the area. Nothing. That's when I found Ida Weathered Journal shoved in the back of the desk drawer. It belonged to the ranger who had worked here last winter, a man named Carl. Most of it was the usual ranger stuff: wildlife sightings, weather patterns, notes on cabin repairs. But the entries toward the end of the journal were strange. Jan 15. Heard voices on the radio again. Thought it was interference, but they're starting to sound familiar, like people I've met before. Jan 20. It's not the radio. It's out there, in the snow. Last night, I heard someone knocking on the door, calling my name. Jan 25. They don't like the fire, keeping the stove burning all night. The last entry was dated 2 days before the journal ended abruptly. Found the cave. I know what it wants now. I'm not going out there, not alone. I couldn't shake the unease the journal left me with. That night, as the storm howled outside, I stayed by the radio, half hoping and half dreading to hear the voice again. And I did. But this time, it wasn't the man. Ranger Post 37. A woman's voice crackled through the static. "Please, help me." Her tone was eerily calm, almost too calm for someone lost in a blizzard. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm here, outside," she replied. The hairs on my arms stood up. There was no way anyone could survive out there in this storm, not for long. But then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. I froze. "Let me in," the voice said, this time louder, more insistent. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed the shotgun hanging on the wall and backed toward the stove, the only source of warmth in the cabin. The knocking continued, more frantic now, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Please, it's so cold. I don't know where I am." It was the man's voice from the radio, mimicking the exact words I had heard the night before. I shouted for them to go away, but the knocking stopped. The cabin went silent, except for the crackling of the fire. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, when the storm finally cleared, I decided to look for the cave Carl had mentioned in his journal. It wasn't hard to find. About a mile from the station, hidden behind a grove of pines, was the entrance, a gaping maw in the rock, almost invisible under the snow. Inside, the air was thick and damp, and the light from my flashlight barely pierced the darkness. The walls were lined with strange carvings, spirals and stick figures that looked ancient. And then I saw them. Bodies, dozens of them, perfectly preserved in the cold, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. That's when I heard the voices again, this time all around me, echoing off the cave walls. "Help us." I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the cabin, but when I got there, the door was wide open, snow drifting inside. The radio crackled to life as I stepped inside. "Ranger Post 37. Do you copy?" It was the rescue team I had called days ago. I grabbed the mic, desperate to tell them everything, but before I could speak, a voice came through the static. "Don't worry. We'll send someone to relieve you soon." It was my voice. When the rescue team arrived 2 days later, they found the cabin empty. My tracks led to the cave, but they said it was sealed off by a rock slide, impossible to enter. The only thing they found was the radio, still turned on, playing a recording of my final transmission. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those mountains, but sometimes, when a storm rolls in, I swear I can still hear those voices calling for help. Just when you thought it couldn't get scarier, here comes the next story. I never believed in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense. My name is Gary Henson, and in the summer of 1971, I was part of a small renovation crew hired to restore the old Methodist church in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. It was one of those sleepy little towns where everyone knew everyone else, and gossip spread faster than wildfire. The church, built in the early 1800s, had fallen into disrepair, and the local congregation was eager to bring it back to life. At first, it seemed like any other job peeling paint, rotted wood, and crumbling stone. Nothing we hadn't dealt with before. The only odd thing was the basement, or rather, the lack of one. On the blueprints we'd been given, there was no mention of a basement at all, which struck me as strange for a building that old. But we didn't think much of it until the third day. We were ripping up the floorboards in the main hall when one of the guys, Paul, found something an iron ring embedded in the floor. It was rusted over, but with some effort, we pried it open, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air that came up was stale and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. Pastor James, the head of the congregation, insisted he had no idea the basement existed. "This must be from the original builders," he said, his voice tight. His reaction seemed genuine, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe. He quickly excused himself, saying he had to make a phone call. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. Armed with flashlights, we descended the steps, the beams of light cutting through layers of dust and cobwebs. The basement was larger than we expected, long corridors with arched ceilings, the walls made of rough-hewn stone. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, the kind you might see in a history book about witch trials or ancient rituals. At the far end of the main corridor, we found a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. It took all four of us to push it open. Inside was a large room, and what we saw made my stomach churn. The walls were covered in faded handprints, ones, like those of children, pressed into what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, stained dark brown. Around it were old, tattered photographs strewn across the floor. Paul picked one up and froze. "Guys, look at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The photograph showed a group of children, maybe 7 or 8 of them, standing in front of the church. They wore Sunday school outfits, smiling innocently, but the back of the photo was dated 1923, and scrawled beneath it were the words, "The Special Congregation." Paul flipped through the rest of the photos, and we all realized the same thing. None of us had seen these children in any of the old church records. When we brought it up with the pastor later, he claimed ignorance, but his face went pale as we handed him the photos. Over the next week, strange things started happening. Tools went missing, only to turn up in places we hadn't been working. We'd hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, but every time we checked, there was no one there. One night, Mike, another guy on the crew, swore he saw a shadow dart across the sanctuary. He brushed it off as nerves, but we all felt it something wasn't right. Then Paul's son, Tommy, went missing. Tommy was only 10, and he often tagged along with his dad after school. He'd sit quietly in a corner with his sketch pad while we worked. That day, Paul had told him to stay in the truck while he helped us seal off the basement. But when we went to leave, Tommy was gone. The truck door was wide open, and his sketch pad lay on the ground outside. We searched the entire area, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. The police got involved, But they didn't find a single trace of him, not in the church, not in the surrounding woods, nowhere. Paul was devastated, but he insisted on coming back to work. "If I stay home, I'll lose my mind," he said. On the last day of the renovation, the congregation held a special service to bless the newly restored church. They invited us to attend as a gesture of gratitude. I wasn't particularly religious, but I went out of respect. The church was packed, the air thick with incense. Pastor James stood at the pulpit, his voice booming as he led the prayers. But something felt off. The congregation wasn't just praying, they were chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Then the lights went out. In the pitch black, I felt a hand grab my arm, cold and clammy. I swung my flashlight around, but the bulb flickered and died. Panic set in as I heard footsteps, hundreds of them, all around me. And then, the whispers. "They're coming back. They're here for us." I stumbled toward the exit, only to find the doors bolted shut. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. In the dim glow of the emergency lights, I saw them, shadows moving along the walls, their shapes twisting and elongating. They weren't human. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The lights came back on, and the congregation was gone. So was my crew. I was alone in the church, the doors wide open as if nothing had happened. I ran out and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what happened in that church. The police found no trace of Paul, Mike, or the others. The basement was sealed off again, this time with concrete. The congregation disbanded shortly after, and Pastor James disappeared without a word. Sometimes I dream about that night, about the whispers and the shadows. And sometimes in the dead of night, I think I hear them again. Sometimes the scariest things are yet to come, like in this next tale. It was supposed to be just another documentary gig, one that would help me pay rent and maybe get my name out there in the film world. I was the sound tech, the guy who carried the boom mic and made sure every whisper was crystal clear. The setting was an old abandoned summer camp in the deep woods of Maine, Camp Echo. Even the name gave me chills, though I laughed it off at the time. The camp had closed down in 1962 after a tragedy that no one in the nearby town wanted to talk about. "It's cursed," one shopkeeper muttered when we stopped for gas on the way up. "You folks shouldn't go there." The rest of the crew laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the way his eyes darted around like he was expecting something to come out of the woods at any moment. Still, a job was a job, and I didn't want to seem like the scared one. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near the crumbling cabins, where moss and vines had taken over what was once a place for kids to laugh and play. It was eerie, sure, but nothing screamed supernatural yet. Then we met her. Her name was Margaret Willis, the sole survivor of the 1962 massacre. She must have been in her late 60s, but her sharp eyes and unsteady voice made her seem far older. She agreed to an interview, though she looked like she wanted to run as soon as we started rolling. "They shouldn't have done it," she said, staring into the camera with tears welling up. "They shouldn't have played with things they didn't understand." "What things?" our director, Lisa, asked. "The counselors. They thought it was all fun and games, carving those symbols into the trees, singing their little chants. They said it was just to connect with nature." Margaret's voice broke, and she looked at us, pleading. It wasn't. It woke something up. We pressed her for more details, but she clammed up after that. The only other thing she said was, "You'll see. If you stay, you'll see." That night we did see. It started small, like most things do. The wind howled through the trees, but it carried a strange whistle, almost like a tune. At first, I thought it was someone from the crew messing around, but then the noises began coming from all sides. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. We stood in a circle near the campfire, staring into the darkness. Shadows danced at the edge of the light, but they didn't move like normal shadows. They twisted and flickered, almost like they were alive. Then we found the markings. On the trees around us, deep carvings had appeared, overnight circles, triangles and spirals that looked ancient. No one had heard or seen anything, yet there they were, freshly gouged into the bark. By the third night, we were all on edge. One of our crew, Jake, went missing. He'd gone to the van to grab a spare battery and never came back. We searched for hours, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. No sign of him, not even a footprint. Lisa decided to keep filming. "If we leave now, we'll never know what happened," she argued, though her hands shook as she adjusted the camera. That's when the forest came alive. The whistling returned, louder this time, and the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and a low hum filled our ears. And then we saw them. Figures stepped out from the shadows, dozens of them. They looked like children, but their eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the darkness. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. Lisa dropped the camera and screamed. I ran. I don't know how long I ran or where I went, but when I finally stopped, I realized I was alone. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. I stumbled back to camp at dawn, only to find the fire burned out and the crew gone. The only thing left was the camera, lying on the ground. When I got back to town, I turned the footage over to the local police, but they didn't believe me. They said the tape was blank. The crew was never found. Camp Echo is still out there, rotting away in the woods. And every now and then, I think I hear that faint whistle in the wind. I don't know what happened that summer, and maybe I never will. All I know is this: some places are meant to be left alone. What you've heard so far was just the beginning. The real terror starts now. I've always had a fascination with old places. You know the type. Boarded-up houses, abandoned schools, forgotten mills. There's something about the way they cling to the past, like they're holding on to secrets they shouldn't. So, when my editor at the Chronicle assigned me to cover the mysterious history of an old textile mill in New England, I didn't hesitate. It was late summer in 1953 when I arrived in Black Hollow, a small mill town tucked into the wooded hills of New Hampshire. The place had a strange, sleepy charm about it. Most of the houses were tightly packed, their white paint peeling under years of neglect. The mill sat at the edge of town, a hulking brick monolith, its smokestacks piercing the overcast sky. I checked into the lone boarding house, run by a woman named Mrs. Pritchard, who looked like she hadn't smiled since the Roosevelt administration. She was polite but distant, her lips thinning when I mentioned the mill. "You're here for that, aren't you?" she asked as she handed me a room key. "For the story, yes," I replied. She didn't say anything more, just muttered something about best leaving old ghosts be and shuffled off to the kitchen. The first couple of days, I dug through the town's library and chatted with locals. Everyone seemed reluctant to talk about the mill. They spoke in whispers, darting their eyes as if someone might overhear. I learned it had shut down abruptly in the late 1920s after a series of strange accidents, machines jamming, fires starting without explanation, and most unsettling, workers vanishing during their shifts. But it wasn't just the accidents that gnawed at the town. Shortly after the mill closed, something even darker began to surface. Children born to former mill workers came into the world with strange deformities, twisted limbs, translucent skin, even patches of what locals described as fabric-like growths on their bodies. Most blamed the dyes the mill had used, particularly a bright crimson color that was said to stain everything it touched. The mill had dumped its waste into the nearby river for years, turning the water a murky red. My first real lead came from a retired worker named Gus, who I found nursing a beer at the town's dingy tavern. "You're poking around where you shouldn't," he growled, but there was a tremor in his voice. After some coaxing and a promise to keep his name out of print, told me about the mill's owner, Ambrose Claremont. "Claremonts ran this town like kings," Gus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Still do, in a way. Ambrose wasn't just a businessman. He was, well, let's just say he had strange hobbies." "Hobbies?" I pressed. "Rituals, experiments, things that make your skin crawl. He had this club, you see, some kind of secret society. They met in the basement of the mill. That's where it all started going wrong." I wanted to know more, but Gus clammed up, muttering, "I've said too much already." By the time I decided to explore the mill itself, the town was starting to feel oppressive. People watched me from behind curtains. Conversations hushed when I entered a room. Even Mrs. Pritchard's usually cold demeanor turned downright hostile. "You'd best leave, Mr. Harlan," she said one night as I came in late. "That mill ain't for you." Ignoring her warning, I waited until midnight and made my way to the mill. The air was thick and still, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Armed with a flashlight and my camera, I slipped through a rusted side door. Inside, the mill was a maze of decaying machinery and sagging wooden beams. The smell of mildew and something chemical lingered in the air. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of old workstations, rows of rusted looms, and spools of thread that had long since turned to dust. Then I found the stairs leading down to the basement. The basement was massive, the walls lined with shelves of jars filled with what looked like pigments and dyes. But as I ventured deeper, the jars became strangersome, contained what I can only describe as organic matter. Twisted clumps of hair, patches of skin, and what looked disturbingly like human eyes. At the far end of the room stood a loom unlike any I'd ever seen. It was massive, with gears and spindles that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Draped across it was a piece of fabric that shimmered like oil on water. As I approached, I noticed something embedded in the weave teeth. Fingernails, strands of hair. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The fabric was made from people. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, a noise broke the silencio, low, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of a loom in motion. But the loom before me was still. I turned to leave, but the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They reached for me, their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. I don't remember how I made it out of the basement, but I found myself stumbling into the dye house, a separate building connected to the main mill. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of old chemicals. In the center of the room stood a massive vat, its surface rippling with a dark, viscous liquid. And there, rising from the vat, was something or someone. The figure was draped in the shimmering fabric I'd seen on the loom, its face obscured by a hood. It spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a sensation, like needles piercing my brain. "Join us," it said. I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoing behind me. I left Black Hollow the next morning, driving until the town and its cursed mill were far behind me. I sent my editor a polite refusal to continue the story and burned my notes. But the nightmares haven't stopped. I still see the loom, the figures, the vat. And sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear the sound of a loom thumping, weaving, calling. The mill is still there, and so is its secret. If you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. They say curiosity killed the cat. Let's see if you're brave enough for what's next. You know how small towns are quiet, tight-knit, full of traditions that nobody really questions. In mine, nothing got people talking like the carnival. Every summer, when the air was thick and smelled like cut grass and sizzling burgers, we'd hear the faint jingle of carnival music drifting in from the highway. It was like a siren call, promising funnel cakes, spinning rides, and nights that felt bigger than anything else in our sleepy little town. In 1975, I was 13 and obsessed with the idea of adventure. My best friend Danny and I couldn't wait for the carnival to roll in that year. It was always the same rootin' bright lights, the Ferris wheel, and barkers yelling out challenges at the Midway Games. But there was something different about this carnival. The posters started showing up, first old-fashioned, almost faded, with that eerie, smiling clown you always see in movies. The kind that looks friendly until you really stare at it. The carnival promised a midnight spectacular, something new they were doing this year. Free admission for the midnight show, it said. Parents frowned, of course, but all the kids were buzzing about it at school. That Friday, Danny and I scraped together every bit of allowance we had and rode our bikes to the field on the outskirts of town. The carnival had set up just like always, giant striped tents, flashing lights, and the smell of popcorn and cotton candy thick in the humid air. But when we got closer, something felt off. The people running the games and rides looked strange. Not bad, exactly just too perfect, like they'd stepped out of an old photograph. The strongman, for example, had a waxed mustache and wore those striped wrestling leotards like you'd see in a history book. The women at the ticket booth had that kind of pin-up style you'd expect from the 1940s. Danny joked about how they were all stuck in the past, but I remember feeling unsettled. Not scared, just watched. We spent the evening playing games and riding rides. When the clock hit 11:45, the carnival barkers started shouting about the midnight spectacular. They directed everyone toward a big dark tent at the back of the grounds. It didn't look like much from the outsideno lights. No flashy signs, just a plain black tarp draped over a wooden frame. Danny elbowed me. "We've got to check it out." Inside, it was darker than I expected. The air smelled musty, like damp wood and old costumes. People shuffled in, whispering to each other. There must have been 50 of us, mostly kids and teenagers. The older folks, the ones who had been milling around outside, didn't come in. A spotlight flicked on, and a man stepped onto the small stage in the center of the tent. He wore a top hat and a long coat with tails. His face was pale, almost too pale, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and rich, "welcome to the Midnight Spectacular. Tonight, you'll witness wonders beyond your imagination." The show started out like any other magic act card tricks, disappearing acts, fire breathing. But there was an edge to it, something too polished, too practiced. The way the performers moved, it was like they were gliding. Then the fortune teller appeared. She was an old woman, bent over and draped in scarves. Her eyes were milky white, like she was blind, but she stared straight at me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low but clear. My heart skipped. "What?" I whispered back, though she was already moving on. The acts grew darker. The knife thrower missed his mark on purpose, pinning a girl's dress to the wall behind her. She screamed, and the audience laughed nervously, unsure if it was part of the show. The clown juggling flaming torches stumbled and nearly set someone's coat on fire. It all felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. And then the mirror maze started. The ringleader led us out of the tent and into the maze, his lantern casting strange flickering shadows on the glass walls. The mirrors weren't clean. They were cloudy, almost warped. Danny and I stuck together at first, weaving through the twisting passages. But then I lost him. "Danny," I called, my voice bouncing back at me from a dozen reflections. I turned a corner and froze. In one of the mirrors I saw something that wasn't me. It looked like me, sure, but its eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark. And it was smiling when I wasn't. I spun around, expecting to see Danny. Instead, I found the ringleader, his lantern dimmed to a soft glow. "The maze shows you who you really are," he said. "What does that mean?" I demanded, backing away. But then I heard it whispers. Not loud, not clear, but everywhere. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt like cold fingers trailing down my neck. I ran. I don't know how I found the exit, but I burst out of that maze, gasping for air. Danny was already outside, pale and shaking. "We need to go," he said. We didn't stop running until we were back at our bikes. The next morning, the carnival was gone. No tents, no rides, nothing but flattened grass and a few scraps of paper blowing in the wind. Danny and I tried to tell people what happened, but no one listened. The carnival would be back next year, they said. It always came back. But it didn't. That was almost 50 years ago, and I've never seen another carnival in our town. Sometimes I wonder if it was real, if any of it happened the way I remember. But then, I'll see something, a faded poster in an antique shop, a picture of a clown in an old bookend. The memories come flooding back. I still hear whispers sometimes, when it's too quiet. And when I look in the mirror, I don't always recognize the person staring back. You haven't heard the worst of it yet. The next story is sure to leave you sleepless. It all started with a job posting in the newspaper position as the keeper of a lighthouse on a remote stretch of the New England coast. I wasn't in the best place in life, to be honest. In 1969, jobs weren't as plentiful as they are now, and I'd been drifting from one odd gig to another since being discharged from the Navy. When I saw the ad, I thought, why not? It'll be quiet, steady work, just me and the ocean. The interview was quick, almost perfunctory. The Coast Guard officer barely asked me anything before pushing papers across the desk for me to sign. Within the week, I was headed to Blackstone Point. The lighthouse was an imposing sight, even in the daylight. Perched on jagged rocks that jutted into the Atlantic, it looked like something out of an old Gothic novel. The town of Blackstone Harbor, where I had to pick up supplies, was just as strange. Everyone I met seemed overly interested in why I wanted the job. Their questions were polite, but their stares lingered too long, and their smiles didn't reach their eyes. When I arrived, the outgoing keeper, a wiry man named Tom Grayson, barely looked at me. He thrust the keys into my hand and muttered something about how he hoped I'd fare better. He left that same afternoon on a small boat, his shoulders hunched as though he couldn't escape fast enough. The first week was uneventful, though the isolation hit me harder than I'd expected. The radio crackled out weather updates and the occasional Coast Guard communication, but otherwise, it was silent. I spent my time cleaning the place, learning the routine, and reading the logbook Tom had left behind. That's when things started to get odd. The entries in the logbook began normally: weather reports, notes about the beacon's condition, and mentions of passing ships. But then, about 2 months ago, the tone changed. Tom started writing about lights, strange, greenish glows that appeared far out to sea on moonless nights. At first, he dismissed them as reflections or ship's lights, but soon his entries took a darker turn. One passage stuck with me. They come closer every night. The lights. They move in patterns, almost like signals. It isn't natural. I hear sounds now, too deep, resonant hums that make the walls vibrate. I can't sleep. I'm starting to think they're trying to communicate, or lure me. That was unsettling enough, but what really disturbed me was the condition of the logbook itself. The later pages were smudged and torn, as if Tom had been gripping the book too hard. The final entry was barely legible. I see them in the storm now. Shadows beneath the waves. God help me. They're not human. I wouldn't have given it much thought if I hadn't seen the lights myself a few nights later. It was a calm, cloudless evening, and I was sitting at the top of the lighthouse, enjoying the stillness. That's when I noticed them dim, greenish orbs dancing across the horizon. They moved in sync, almost like a school of fish, but they were far too bright. I watched them for over an hour, feeling both mesmerized and uneasy. It wasn't until they vanished all at once that I realized I'd been gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself it was nothing phosphorescent algae, maybe, or some kind of military test. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I received a radio call about a ship that had gone missing nearby. The Coast Guard asked if I'd seen anything unusual, but I didn't mention the lights. What would I even say? Later that day, a fishing boat towed the missing vessel into the harbor. Its crew was nowhere to be found, but what really unnerved everyone was what was on board. The bodies weren't missing, they were there, preserved as if frozen in time, their eyes wide open and their mouths contorted in silent screams. The townsfolk muttered about the curse, but no one would explain what they meant. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that makes you feel like the world is ending. The wind howled, the waves crashed against the rocks, and the beacon struggled to cut through the rain. It was during one of the lightning flashes that I saw the outline of a massive submerged structure far out at sea. It looked like a city. The next day, I confronted one of the fishermen who delivered supplies. He hesitated before finally speaking. "Blackstone Point has a history," he said, lowering his voice. "That lighthouse was built to keep more than ships safe. There's things out there, old things. And people here, they've made their peace with it. You'd do well to keep quiet and do your job. Don't stir the waters. That was when I noticed the faint webbing between his fingers. The storm that ended my time at Blackstone Point was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The wind was so fierce, it felt like the lighthouse would collapse. But it wasn't the storm that terrified me, was the sound. It started as a low hum, the same one Tom had written about, but it grew louder, more insistent. It vibrated in my chest, in my skull. I stumbled outside, desperate to see what was causing it. The ocean was alive with movement. The green lights were back, swirling in hypnotic patterns, and within their glow, I saw shapes rising from the waves, figures with elongated limbs and pale, translucent skin. One of them turned toward me, and for a moment, I saw its face. It was almost human. Almost. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in the hospital days later, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The Coast Guard told me the lighthouse had been destroyed in the storm, and I was the only survivor. I tried to tell people what I'd seen, but no one believed me. The townfolk of Blackstone Harbor stayed silent, their strange smiles returning whenever I pressed for answers. I left New England as soon as I could, but even now, 50 years later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that hum again. Ready for more? Because the next story will make you question everything. It all started in the summer of 1992. I was fresh out of college and eager to prove myself as a junior historian for a small historical preservation society based in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it let me explore old buildings and dig through archives. That summer, we were contracted by the state to document an old coal mining town, a place called Armitage Hollow. The town had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. Officially, it was due to declining coal production and a series of devastating floods in the early 60s. But locals whispered darker stories, strange illnesses, entire families vanishing overnight, and even sightings of things lurking in the woods. I didn't put much stock in rumors back then. I wish I had. Our team of 5, me, Beth, our lead archivist, Joe, a seasoned photographer, Lisa, an archaeologist, and Mark, our driver and general muscle, arrived on a humid July morning. The town was a crumbling skeleton of its former self. Sagging rooftops, shattered windows, and rusted street signs lined the overgrown roads. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The first few hours were uneventful. We split up to survey the area, mapping the town and cataloging anything of interest. The main street was eerily intact, with faded shop signs and a crumbling church steeple poking above the treetops. But it was the mine entrance at the edge of town that drew our attention. The shaft had been sealed with heavy steel plates welded into place. A faded sign hung crookedly on the fence surrounding it. Danger, radiation contamination, keep out. Radiation? Beth frowned, snapping a photo of the sign. That's not in any of the official reports. Lisa shrugged. Could be leftover from the Cold War paranoia. They slapped those signs on anything back then. Joe, always the skeptic, laughed. Or it's just a way to keep nosy people out. I didn't say anything, but the sign made my stomach twist. Something about it felt wrong. By evening, we set up camp in what used to be the town square. A cold wind swept through the hollow as the sun dipped behind the hills. Joe lit a lantern, and the warm glow pushed back the encroaching darkness. While we ate, Beth shared her findings. The last recorded census in 1962 listed over 200 residents. By 1965, not a single one remained. No explanation, no forwarding addresses, just gone. That's not creepy at all, Mark muttered, poking at his canned stew. Lisa chimed in. I found some animal bones near the mine entrance. They were weirdly deformed extra limbs, misshapen skulls. Could be from chemical runoff or something. Or something, Joe echoed with a smirk. We laughed it off, but the unease settled deeper into my chest. The wind carried strange sounds, that night-distant whispers, faint footsteps crunching through the brush. The next day, we focused on the mine. Joe climbed the fence to get better photos, while the rest of us inspected the perimeter. Lisa found a small side tunnel partially collapsed, but not sealed. It looked just big enough for us to crawl through. "Should we?" Lisa asked, shining her flashlight into the gaping hole. "Absolutely not," Mark said, crossing his arms. "If the main shaft is sealed, there's a reason for it." Beth agreed, but curiosity got the better of me and Joe. With some effort, we widened the opening and squeezed through. The air inside was thick and metallic. Rusted mining equipment littered the ground, and strange white fungi clung to the walls. Deeper in, we found something we couldn't explain: charred, skeletal remains. They weren't human, at least, not entirely. By the third day, things took a turn for the worse. Lisa and Beth started feeling nauseous, complaining of headaches and dizziness. Joe noticed strange tracks around our campsite barefoot, human-like, but with clawed toes. Mark wanted to leave, but Beth insisted we stay. "We're here to document history," she argued. "We can't run because of some creepy wildlife." That evening, the tracks led us back to the mine. We discovered a hidden door in the rock face near the main shaft, almost like an airlock. It wasn't on any of the maps. We forced the door open, and what we found inside still haunts my dreams. The room was filled with rusting medical equipment and rows of broken glass cylinders, large enough to hold a person. Strange diagrams covered the walls: genetic mutations, radiation experiments, and charts documenting generations of inbreeding. Beth gasped, pointing at a faded government seal stamped on a file cabinet. Project Lazarus. Before we could process what we'd seen, we heard a guttural screech echoing through the tunnels. They came at us from the shadows, grotesque figures twisted by generations of isolation and exposure to whatever had poisoned this place. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their eyes reflective like an animal's. Mark fought them off with a crowbar while we scrambled to escape. Joe didn't make it. One of the creatures dragged him screaming into the darkness. We barely made it back to the surface. The remaining townsfolk, if you could call them, that watched us from the tree line as we fled. The state quietly shut down our project. All our evidence, photos, notes, recordings vanished. They claimed it was a miscommunication, but we knew better. To this day, I can't prove what happened in Armitage Hollow, but every now and then, I dream of those creatures and wonder if they're still there, lurking beneath the earth, waiting for someone foolish enough to return. What's scarier than the last story, the one you're about to hear? In September of 1963, I took a long-term substitute teaching position at Maple Hollow High School, a small rural school tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. At the time, I was 26 and eager to gain experience. My job was to fill in for a history teacher who, according to the principal, had left unexpectedly mid-semester. I didn't pry. People had their reasons for quitting, and it wasn't my business. The school itself was quaint 2 stories of red brick, surrounded by sprawling fields and dense woods. The students were polite, though oddly quiet. They never seemed to talk amongst themselves, even between classes. At first, I chalked it up to small-town manners. My classroom was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the woods. It was sparsely decorated, save for a large wooden desk in the corner and a faded map of the United States pinned to the wall. The desk drawers were locked when I arrived, which I found strange. I asked the janitor for a key, but he simply shrugged and said, "Best leave it be, ma'am." That night, as I unpacked my suitcase in the tiny apartment the school provided, I couldn't shake an odd feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a persistent unease, as though I was being watched. I dismissed it as nerves. The next day, I started teaching. The students were bright and attentive, but their behavior was peculiar. They answered questions in unison, their voices eerily synchronized. If one of them laughed, they all did. If one turned to look out the window, the rest followed. At first, I thought it was a prank. When I asked them about it, they just smiled. A smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. On Friday, during my free period, I decided to explore the desk in the corner of the classroom. Armed with a bobby pin, I managed to pick the lock on the top drawer. Inside, I found a stack of old papers, lesson plans, and a leather-bound journal with the name Mr. Hargrove embossed on the cover. The entries were dated from earlier that year. At first, they seemed normal notes about classes and student progress. But as I read further, the tone changed. April 3rd, the students are acting strange. They whisper to each other in a language I don't recognize. I'm certain I heard them chanting this morning before the bell rang. April 12th, last night I followed them into the woods. They were gathered around a fire, reciting something in unison. I couldn't understand the words, but it sounded ancient. Wrong. April 20th, I tried to confront Principal Adler today. He brushed me off, said I was imagining things. But I'm not. Something is happening here, something dark. The final entry was dated May 15th, the day Mr. Hargrove disappeared. It read simply, "They know I've been watching." Over the next few weeks, I became more vigilant. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The janitor, the cafeteria workers, even the principal, all of them avoided direct eye contact. The townspeople were no different, their smiles tight, their conversations clipped. One evening, as I was leaving the school, I saw a group of students heading toward the woods. Heart pounding, I decided to follow them. Keeping a safe distance, I trailed them through the trees until they reached a clearing. A large stone altar stood in the center, surrounded by torches. The students were arranged in a circle, chanting in that same guttural, unfamiliar language Mr. Hargrove had described. My breath caught when I saw Principal Adler among them, holding a knife. I stumbled backward, snapping a branch underfoot. The chanting stopped. Dozens of heads turned in unison, their eyes locking onto mine. The following Monday, I planned to leave. I packed my things and told the principal I was feeling unwell. He smiled, but his eyes betrayed something darker. "You'll stay through the graduation ceremony, won't you? It's a tradition here. Very important." I didn't answer. That night I barricaded my door. Graduation was scheduled for Friday evening. The entire town gathered in the gymnasium, their faces lit with a strange anticipation. The students, dressed in black robes, filed onto the stage. Principal Adler stepped forward to speak. "Tonight, we honor the legacy of Maple Hollow," he said, his voice booming. A tradition passed down through generations. The lights flickered, and the room grew eerily silent. Then the chanting began. I don't remember much of what happened next. I recall screams, the metallic smell of blood, and the cold grip of someone's hand on my wrist. I woke up hours later in my apartment, my suitcase by the door. I left Maple Hollow that morning and never looked back. I later learned that every few years a teacher at that school would go missing. The disappearances were always explained: aware relocation, illness, personal matters. I tried to report what I'd seen, but the authorities dismissed me. Without evidence, my story sounded absurd. I still dream about that night sometimes. I hear the chanting, see the flickering torches, feel those dozens of eyes staring into me. I'll never know what really happened in Maple Hollow. But I know this: whatever it wasn't human. If you thought the last story was haunting, this next one will send shivers down your spine. I wasn't always a wedding photographer. I fell into it by accident, really. Back in 1978, I was just a guy trying to make ends meet, picking up gigs where I could. Photography was my side hustle. Weddings were easy money: snap some pictures of happy people, collect your paycheck, and move on. It was a brisk October morning when I arrived at St. Mary's Church for the Reynolds-Lawson wedding. The bride, Claire, was glowing, and the groom, Andrew, couldn't stop grinning. The church itself was beautiful, but old stone walls weathered with age, stained glass windows that seemed to watch you, and creaky wooden pews. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and I busied myself capturing every detail: the exchange of rings, the nervous laughter during the vows, and the kiss that sealed the deal. By the time the reception started, I was on autopilot, blending into the background and snapping candid shots of guests dancing, drinking, and laughing. It wasn't until I developed the photos a week later that something strange caught my eye. In one of the group shots, there was a guest I didn't remember seeing that day. She wasn't standing with the rest of the family or even dressed like them. While everyone else was wearing modern suits and dresses, she wore an old-fashioned gown, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white photos from decades ago. She was in the far corner of the frame, almost blending into the shadows. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes seemed wrong. I chalked it up to a trick of the light, or maybe an error in the film. It wasn't until the second wedding that things got weirder. A month later, I was hired for another wedding at St. Mary's. Different couple, same church. This time, I made a point to pay more attention to the guests. Everything seemed normal. The ceremony was beautiful, and the reception was lively. But when I developed the photos, there she was again. The same woman, she stood in the background of a candid shot, watching the bride and groom dance their first dance. Same vintage gown, same unnerving stare. By the third wedding, I was actively looking for her. I scanned the guests during the ceremony and the reception, but I never saw her. Yet, when the photos came back, she was there. This time, she was closer. She wasn't just a blur in the background anymore. In one picture, she stood just a few feet away from the bride, her pale hands clasped in front of her and her face tilted slightly downward, almost as if she were observing. I started digging into old wedding albums from St. Mary's. It took some convincing, but a few couples let me borrow their albums to study. The pattern was unmistakable. She appeared in photos dating back at least 30 years, always in the background, always near the bride. It wasn't just her presence that sent chills down my spine. In every single case, the bride had gone missing within days of the wedding. Claire Reynolds had vanished during her honeymoon. Her husband claimed she'd gone out for a walk one evening and never returned. The police found no trace of her. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was this woman? Why was she haunting these weddings? And what happened to the missing brides? I returned to St. Mary's under the pretense of photographing the church for a historical project. The priest, an older man with a wary demeanor, seemed hesitant but allowed me access. The crypt beneath the church was cold and damp, with a labyrinth of tunnels that seemed to stretch forever. I wandered deeper, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, until I stumbled upon a small chamber. The air was thick with decay, and my stomach churned as I took in the scene. The walls were lined with mannequins dressed in wedding gowns, each one stained and torn. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, adorned with dried flowers and candles burned down to their stubs. And there she was. She sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, clutching a tattered veil in her hands. Her gown was filthy, yellowed with age, but unmistakably the same one from the photos. She looked up at me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Her eyes were empty, yet filled with an indescribable malice. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. I turned and ran, tripping over stones and clawing my way back to the surface. I never returned to St. Mary's, and I quit wedding photography for good. But sometimes, late at night, I'll see her face in my mind, those hollow eyes, that eerie, timeless gown, and I'll wonder how many more brides she's claimed since then. Brace yourself, because the next story might be the one you'll never forget. It was the summer of 1969, a year of protests, moon landings, and a world buzzing with change. But for me, Linda Patterson, life wasn't so much about changing the world as it was about making ends meet. I was 22, fresh out of high school with no real prospects, so when the Midnight Diner offered me a job on their graveyard shift, I took it without much thought. The diner sat lonely on Route 56, a stretch of highway that felt like it was forgotten by time. The neon sign buzzed faintly, advertising 24-hour service, though most nights we were lucky to get more than a handful of customers. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid, and I figured it was safer than being out in the city at night. I quickly learned the rhythm of the place. Regular truckers coming in for coffee and pie, the occasional car full of teenagers looking for cheap eats after a night of mischief, and oddly enough a man who came in almost every night, like clockwork, always ordering raw meat. He introduced himself as Mr. Albright, mid-40s, balding, with a wiry frame that made his clothes hang loose, like they weren't quite his. He always wore the same brown suit, slightly wrinkled, and carried an old leather briefcase. He'd sit in the same booth in the far corner, away from the windows, and barely say more than a grunt when I brought him his plate. At first, I thought the raw meat thing was some kind of dietary quirk, maybe a fad I hadn't heard about, but it was unsettling. He'd cut into the flesh with a pocket knife, chew slowly, and stare out at nothing. When I asked the cook about it, he shrugged. Man pays cash, doesn't complain. What do I care if he eats like a wolf? The nights dragged on. A month in, I started hearing rumors from the truckers. Guys disappearing on nearby routes. Joe, the one with the handlebar mustache, said his buddy Earl vanished after hauling a load upstate. Stopped at a rest area, never made it back to the cab, Joe muttered over his third cup of coffee. Just poof, gone. One night, after the rush had died down and it was just me and Mr. Albright, I decided to take the trash out back. The air was sticky, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the night. I flipped the lid of the dumpster and froze. There, on top of the trash bags, was a bundle of fabric soaked in something dark. I pulled it out, a uniform like the one I wore, but torn and stained with what I could only assume was blood. My stomach churned. It wasn't just any uniform. It had a name tag. Doris, it read. Doris was the girl who worked my shift before me. I'd never met her, but everyone said she quit without notice. Just up and left one night, never picked up her paycheck. I shoved the uniform back into the dumpster and went inside, shaking. Mr. Albright was still in his booth, methodically slicing his raw meat, but he glanced up as I entered. For the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. The next morning, I confronted Frank, the diner manager. He laughed it off. "You're letting the graveyard shift get to you," he said, slapping a greasy hand on my shoulder. "Doris didn't quit. She just moved on, found something better." But something in his voice didn't sit right. The days bled into weeks. More truckers went missing. Mr. Albright's visits never faltered. Each time he ordered, his tone was sharper, more deliberate. Raw, not overdone. Then one night, after Mr. Albright had left, I found myself alone with curiosity and a creeping sense of dread. I decided to follow him. He drove an old Buick, the kind that sputtered like it was on its last legs. I kept a safe distance as he took the back roads. After about 10 minutes, he pulled into a lot behind what looked like an abandoned warehouse. No lights, no signs, just a broken-down building surrounded by dense woods. I parked a little ways back and watched as he disappeared inside. My heart hammered, but I couldn't just leave. Something told me this place held answers. I crept up to a side window, peering in. The inside was worse than I imagined. Large hooks dangled from the ceiling, glinting faintly in the moonlight. The floor was slick with something dark, and in the center of it all, a massive butcher's table. Then I saw them shapes hanging from the hooks. They weren't animals. I stumbled back, trying not to scream, and ran for my car. The next day, I called the sheriff. I told him everything. He nodded, listened, but there was something in his eye-sand emptiness that made me uneasy. A week later, I noticed the diner had a new waitress. And Mr. Albright? He still came in every night. I quit the following morning. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the hum of that neon sign. And I wonder how much of that meat wasn't cow. Don't relax just yet. The real nightmare is about to begin. I'll never forget the first time I stepped into the dimly lit halls of Harrington University's library. It was the summer of 1952, and I was looking for a quiet job to keep me afloat while pursuing my teaching degree. The library seemed perfect calm, structured, and predictable. But looking back now, I wish I had walked out that first day and never looked back. Harrington was known for its history. The library, in particular, was a grand stone structure, towering over the rest of the campus. Built in 1893, It had an air of mystery about it, with its dark wooden beams, narrow corridors, and rows upon rows of ancient books. The head librarian, Miss Eleanor Fairfax, was an imposing woman in her 60s. She had sharp, gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. When I came in for the interview, she barely looked up from her desk. "You'll be responsible for cataloging returns, shelving, and maintaining the East Wing," she said curtly. "Do your job well, and you'll have no trouble here." Her tone left no room for questions. I nodded, eager to prove myself. The first few weeks were uneventful. The East Wing was mostly used by graduate students and professors, and it housed some of the oldest books in the library's collection. The shelves smelled of aged paper and leather, and the faint scent of varnish lingered in the air. But there were things that didn't sit right with me. The students who frequented the East Wing were different, quiet, withdrawn. They rarely made eye contact and seemed almost too eager to leave once they checked out their books. Then there were the books themselves. Many had no titles, only strange symbols etched onto their spines. Some were so old that their pages crumbled at the slightest touch. One evening, as I was shelving returns, I noticed faint carvings on the edge of one of the wooden shelves. They looked like runes or symbols, scratched deep into the wood. I brushed it off, at first graffiti, maybe, from students long gone. But the more I looked, the more I found. Every few shelves had similar markings, some fresher than others. About a month into the job, I overheard two professors talking in hushed voices near the front desk. "Another one of them whispered. "That's the third student this year." "Yes, and always after borrowing from the East Wing," the other replied. "Someone should report this." Miss Fairfax's sharp voice interrupted them. "Gentlemen, if you have concerns, I suggest you take them elsewhere." They quickly dispersed, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I tried to push the conversation from my mind, but it lingered. One rainy evening, while shelving books in the East Wing, I noticed a small leather-bound notebook tucked behind a row of thick tomes. It looked like it had been deliberately hidden. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was cramped and spidery, the ink faded with age. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Greaves, the library's head librarian from 1912 to 1937. As I read, a chilling picture began to emerge. Greaves wrote of a ritual pattern, a sequence of books that had to be checked out in a specific order. Each book was tied to a sacrifice, though the journal didn't explain what that meant. One passage stopped me cold. "The shelves bear the symbols to guide the willing. The collection grows with each offering, and the library's power endures. Those who vanish are not lost, they are bound." Unable to sleep, I returned to the library late that night. I had to know more. Armed with a flashlight, I crept into the East Wing and began comparing the journal's notes to the books on the shelves. That's when I noticed something I had overlooked before. Some of the books weren't bound in leather. The texture was wrong, too soft, too smooth. My stomach churned as I realized the horrifying truth. They were bound in human skin. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the spines, each labeled with a faint name etched in gold. Were these the missing students? As I turned to leave, the beam of my flashlight fell on Miss Fairfax. She was standing at the end of the aisle, her face expressionless. "You've been busy," she said, her voice calm. I don't understand," I stammered, clutching the journal. "You shouldn't have found that," she replied, stepping closer. "The library must be fed. It has always been this way." Panic overtook me. I shoved past her and ran, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. I never went back to Harrington University. I dropped out and moved to another town, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the nightmares persist. Sometimes I dream of the library and the rows of books with human names on their spines. I tried researching Harrington years later, but there was no mention of missing students or strange rituals. The library still stands, its secrets buried deep within its walls. And yet, I can't help but wonder how many more books have been added to the collection since I left. The next story will make the last one feel like a bedtime tale. In 1975, I was 24 years old, fresh out of college, and looking for work. The economy was in a slump, and jobs weren't exactly falling into my lap. My parents kept pushing me to find something, anything, so I finally caved and answered a flyer at the local diner. It read, "Night security needed. Beacon Drive. In theater. 3 hour. No experience required." It wasn't glamorous, but I figured it was easy enough. Sit around, keep an eye on things, maybe catch a few movies for free. I called the number and was told to come in the next evening for an interview. Beacon Drive-In wasn't anything special. It was tucked at the edge of town, surrounded by tall pines and a crumbling chain-link fence. The massive screen stood like a monolith, weathered but still functional. Rows of gravel stretched out in front of it, marked by fading yellow poles with rusted speakers attached. When I arrived, the manager, a wiry man named Mr. Grayson, greeted me with a toothy grin. His handshake was firm, his smile just a little too wide. "Robert, right? Glad you're here. It's an easy gig. Lock up when the last car leaves, make sure no one messes with the equipment, and report anything unusual." "Unusual?" I asked. He chuckled, but his eyes didn't. "Teenagers sneaking in, stray dogs, that sort of thing. You'll be fine." I started the next night. The first shift was uneventful. I wandered the lot as the projector hummed and the screen flickered with Jaws. Families huddled in their cars. Kids popped out of windows, and the smell of popcorn drifted from the snack shack. By midnight, the lot had mostly cleared out. I made a quick round, locked the gates, and called it a night. It stayed that way for a while. Boring, repetitive, but easy money. Then came that night. It was a Tuesday, dead quiet. The movie had ended, and I was doing my usual rounds. Most of the cars had left, but one, a black Chevy Impala still, sat in the far corner of the lot. Its engine was running, headlights off. I walked over, shining my flashlight into the driver's side window. "Hey, the show's over," I called out. No response. I tapped on the glass. The figure in the driver's seat didn't move. "Sir?" When I opened the door, the interior light flickered on, and I realized the car was empty. The keys were in the ignition, the engine rumbling softly, but there wasn't a soul inside. A chill ran down my spine. I turned the car off and pocketed the keys, figuring someone had left in a hurry and would come back for it. But no one ever did. The next morning, I brought the keys to Mr. Grayson. He barely glanced at them before tossing them into a drawer in his office. Inside, I noticed at least a dozen other sets of keys, each labeled with a tag listing make, model, and date. "People forget their cars all the time," he said casually. "Don't worry about it." It didn't sit right with me, but I didn't push it. A few nights later, another Cara Green Dodge Dart was left behind. This time, the radio was blaring static, and the back seat was soaked, as if someone had poured a bucket of water inside. I reported it to Mr. Grayson the next day. Again, he brushed it off. "Probably some drunk," he muttered. One slow night, I wandered into the manager's office while he was out. I'd always been curious about that drawer. I opened it, revealing rows of keys and neatly labeled envelopes. Inside, each envelope was a small photo. They were snapshots of people, smiling couples, families with kids, lone drivers. The dates on the envelopes matched the nights I'd seen the cars. My stomach churned as I flipped through them. These weren't just any people. They were the ones who'd never come back for their vehicles. The next night, I decided to explore. I'd always been told to stay away from the area behind the screen, but curiosity got the better of me. What I found was bizarre. A massive metal structure loomed behind the screen, covered in wires and rusting panels. It hummed faintly, emitting a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my chest. I climbed a ladder to get a closer look, but before I could investigate further, Mr. Grayson appeared out of nowhere. "What the hell are you doing back here?" he barked, his face red with anger. I stammered an excuse, and he sent me home early. I couldn't let it go. The keys, the photos, the strange machine, it all pointed to something sinister. One night, I stayed late, hiding in the shadows as Grayson locked up. Around 2 a.m., a black van pulled into the lot. 2 men in lab coats emerged, followed by Grayson. They headed behind the screen. I crept closer, watching as they opened a hidden hatch at the base of the structure. Inside was a staircase leading underground. The sound of muffled voices and machinery echoed from below. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The following night, I confronted Grayson. "What's going on here?" I demanded. He just smiled. "Some questions are better left unanswered, Robert." When I threatened to go to the police, his demeanor changed. "You think anyone's going to believe you? Go ahead, try." I quit that night. Years later, I saw a news story about missing persons in my hometown. The Beacon Drive-In had closed down, and the site was fenced off. Officially, nothing unusual was ever found, but I know what I saw. And I still hear that low hum in my dreams. Whatever you do, don't turn away now. The next tale is even more horrifying. In the summer of 1988, I started a new job at Meadowview Retirement Home. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, but as a fresh nursing school graduate, I was grateful for the opportunity. Meadowview was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by woods that always seemed too quiet. Something about the place felt off, but I chalked it up to nerves. I worked the day shift alongside other nurses and caretakers. Most of the residents were frail and soft-spoken, grateful for any kindness we offered, but some seemed deeply unsettled, staring into corners or muttering under their breath. "They come at night," one woman whispered to me as I helped her with dinner. "You'll see. They always come at night." I smiled politely and told her to rest. Nighttime ramblings, I thought, but her words lingered. About 2 weeks in, I noticed something strange. One of the residents, Mr. Hargrove, a lively 72-year-old who often entertained us with war stories, looked drastically different overnight. His face was sunken, his hands frail, his voice barely a whisper. "Rough night?" I joked, but he didn't respond. When I checked his chart, my stomach turned. His vitals showed he was in critical condition, and his listed age was now 92. A clerical error, I assumed, though I couldn't understand how he had aged 2 decades in a single night. By the next morning, Mr. Hargrove had passed away. His body was taken away by staff I'd never seen before as strangers, dressed in spotless white uniforms, their faces expressionless. One evening, I stayed late to cover for a sick coworker. The night staff was a separate team, and I rarely interacted with them, but as the sun set, the halls grew eerily quiet. I was preparing medication when I heard Ida's soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. I froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to come from the room at the end of the hallway, the one where Mr. Hargrove had stayed. When I peeked in, the room was empty. But the window was open, the sheer curtains billowing inward. I could have sworn I'd closed it earlier. The next day, I noticed faint bruises on Mrs. Carter's neck, 2 small circular impressions that looked like pinpricks. "What happened here?" I asked her gently. She flinched and shook her head. "The nightmen," she whispered. "They're taking our time." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I checked the other residents and found similar marks on several of them. I brought it up with the administrator, Mr. Fletcher, an unnervingly calm man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He dismissed my concerns, saying the marks were likely caused by IV lines or mild skin irritations. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. That night, I found an envelope tucked under my locker. Inside was a crumpled note written in shaky handwriting. "Get out while you can. They're using us." No signature, no explanation. The next day, I asked about the nurse who worked my position before me. The staff avoided my questions, offering vague answers about her sudden departure. But one janitor, a kind older man named Earl, pulled me aside. "She didn't leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They made her disappear. Same thing they'll do to you if you dig too deep." Determined to uncover the truth, I stayed late again, this time hiding in the supply closet near the patient rooms. At around midnight, I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate. Peeking through the slats, I saw them, 3 figures in white uniforms, wheeling a gurney into the room of Mrs. Carter. They moved like shadows, silent and unnerving. When they left, I crept into the room. Mrs. Carter was unconscious, her breathing shallow. On her neck were fresh marks, the skin around them raw and bruised. Then I noticed the charts on the counter. Flipping through them, I found impossible patterns. Residents listed as 80 years old one day were suddenly 90 the next. The medical records didn't make sense, showing rapid declines with no medical explanation. The final straw came when I found the elevator hidden behind an authorized personnel-only door in the basement. I knew I shouldn't, but curiosity pushed me forward. The elevator descended into a cold, sterile hallway. At the end was a large steel door slightly ajar. Inside, I saw what can only be described as a laboratory. Machines beeped and whirred, hooked up to elderly patients lying unconscious on gurneys. Clear tubes ran from their arms, draining a strange, glowing substance into glass containers. At the center of it all was Mr. Fletcher. He stood tall and commanding, his face eerily youthful. "They give us life," he said, noticing me. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic. "And in return, we give them peace." I stumbled back, heart racing. I don't know how I managed to get out. My memory of that night is a blur of panic and adrenaline. I quit the next morning, without explanation, packed my things and left town. But the nightmares followed me. I searched for any trace of Meadowview years later, but it was as if the place had never existed. Sometimes, I wake up with strange bruises on my neck. If you thought that was unsettling, brace yourself for what's coming next. I've never been one to shy away from a good mystery. Being a small-town sheriff in 1961 meant my days were mostly spent chasing down missing livestock or breaking up the occasional bar fight. But the summer of '61 was different, marked by something far darker than I'd ever imagined. Looking back, I wish I'd never taken the call. It all started on an otherwise ordinary Thursday morning. The phone in my office rang, its metallic buzz cutting through the stillness. On the other end was Mrs. Callahan, a frantic mother whose 8-year-old son Billy hadn't come home after visiting the county fair the night before. At first, I wasn't too concerned. Kids wander off all the time, especially at the fair. The lights, the music, the game set was a world of distractions. But as I took more calls over the next few days, parents reporting their children missing, all of them last seen at the fair, I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. The fair had rolled into town just a week earlier, setting up shop in the wide-open fields on the outskirts. It was the usual affair: brightly painted rides, colorful tents, the smell of cotton candy and fried dough in the air. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to investigate, starting with the carnival workers. Most of them were friendly enough, though a bit guarded. Carnies are used to people looking down on them, so their wariness didn't strike me as odd at first. What did unsettle me was the fortune teller. Her tent was tucked away at the edge of the fairgrounds, draped in dark, tattered fabric. A sign out front read, "Madame Vashti, Seer of Secrets." I stepped inside, and the air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of incense. Madame Vashti was an older woman, her face pale and expressionless, as if carved from marble. Her eyes, though they seemed to pierce right through me. "You seek answers," she said, her voice a low murmur. "But be careful, Sheriff. Some truths are better left buried." I tried to press her for more, but she just smiled, her thin lips curling in a way that made my skin crawl. That night, I returned to the fairgrounds after closing. Armed with a flashlight and my revolver, I began my search. The place was eerily silent, the vibrant energy of the day replaced by an oppressive stillness. As I approached the Hall of Mirrors, I felt a strange pull. The building loomed ahead, its entrance framed by twisted columns that seemed almost alive in the moonlight. Inside, the air was thick, and the dim lighting made the reflections even more disorienting. At first, it was just my reflection staring back at me, the beams of my flashlight bouncing off the glass. But then I noticed someone in the corner of one of the mirrors. A small figure, barely visible, standing perfectly still. "Billy?" I called out, my voice echoing. The figure didn't move, heart pounding. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. The child's reflection wasn't in the mirror itself, but in the space between the mirrors, as though he were trapped behind the glass. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The shadows seemed to shift, and suddenly, I was surrounded by reflections that weren't my own. Children's faces, pale and frightened, stared at me from every angle. I ran, bursting out of the Hall of Mirrors and into the cool night air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. But the nightmare wasn't over. In the following days, I uncovered more disturbing details. Old photographs in the town archives showed the same carnival workers, unchanged, dating back to the 1920s. Rumors of missing children seemed to follow the fair wherever it went, always spaced about 20 years apart. The more I dug, the more sinister the picture became. A former carnival worker, now living in hiding, told me in hushed tones about rituals, about feeding on the youth to sustain themselves. He described carnival props like the skeletons in the haunted house being made from the bones of their victims. The final straw came when the mayor's 2 children went missing. He demanded answers, but the local police chief, who I later discovered had been taking bribes from the carnival, dismissed it as hysteria. The fair packed up and left town in the dead of night, leaving no trace behind. The missing children were never found. I still don't know exactly what happened. Were the carnival workers human? Something else entirely? All I know is that wherever they are now, they'll be back. And when they return, another town will pay the price. Even now, years later, I can't go near a carnival without feeling that cold knot of dread. Because I know the truth. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The last story was chilling, but this next one will leave you speechless. I wasn't looking for a thrill when I took the job at WXKR 97.9. It was 1983, and I was just a guy trying to make ends meet. My name is David Peterson, and back then I was fresh out of college with a degree in communications and 0 job prospects. When the opportunity came up to host the graveyard shift at a small local radio station in rural Michigan, I figured, why not? It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. WXKR was the kind of station that nobody really listened to unless they were stuck in their car late at night. Classic rock, a few easy listening tracks, and the occasional call-in show made up most of the programming. My shift started at midnight and ran until 6 a.m. The station was in an old, creaky building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and a rusting chain-link fence. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it wasn't threatening either, just your average, slightly neglected workplace. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd sit in the studio, play records, and sometimes take calls from truckers passing through or lonely night owls looking for company. The station manager, Mr. Ross, rarely came by during my shift. He'd show up during the day to handle paperwork and leave before sunset. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was a quiet Tuesday night when the first strange call came in. The phone rang at 2:37 a.m. I remember the time because I had just announced the weather and was reaching for my coffee. "WXKR, you're on the air," I said, trying to sound cheerful despite the hour. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice crackled through the static. It was faint and raspy, like someone speaking from far away or underwater. "Play Moonlight Serenade." I frowned. We don't usually play that kind of music here. Are you sure you've got the right station?" The line went dead. I shrugged it off as a prank. People get weird late at night, and I'd had my fair share of odd requests. But something about the voice stuck with me. It didn't sound like someone pulling a joke. It sounded desperate. The next night, I was digging through the station's archives, looking for something to fill the time. WXKR had been around since the 1950s, and the back room was packed with dusty vinyl records, old reel-to-reel tapes, and boxes of forgotten paperwork. I found a reel labeled Final Broadcasts. Curious, I loaded it onto the player. The tape hissed to life, and I heard a voice I didn't recognize, a man, speaking with a calm but eerie tone. "This is WXKR, signing off for the last time." There was a long pause, followed by static. Then another voice, a woman this time, repeating the same phrase. I rewound the tape and listened again. The dates on the reel spanned decades, but the pattern was always the same. A DJ signing off, followed by silence. It was unsettling, but I figured it was just an old tradition the station had abandoned. I put the tape back and tried to forget about it. A week later, the calls started coming more frequently. Each time the voice was different, but the requests were oddly specific songs we didn't have in our library, some of them from obscure artists I'd never heard of. One night, someone asked for a track by a singer who had died in the 1950s. When I told them I couldn't find it, the line went dead again. By now, I was starting to notice other things. The signal seemed to reach farther than it should. I got calls from towns that weren't even in our broadcast range. One trucker swore he picked us up in Indiana, over 100 miles away. Mr. Ross dismissed my concerns when I brought them up. "You're overthinking it, Peterson," he said, his voice tight. "Just do your job." Late one night, while going through some old files, I found a handwritten note tucked inside a dusty folder. It was from the station's first engineer, dated 1954. It read, "The signal is stronger than anticipated. The frequency does things. Be careful who listens." I stared at the note, my heart pounding. What did he mean by "does things"? I wanted to ask Mr. Ross, but he had become increasingly elusive, avoiding my questions and brushing off my concerns. It all came to a head on a stormy night in early December. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the power flickered on and off. I was in the middle of my shift when the phone rang again. "WXKR, you're on the air." The voice on the other end was barely a whisper. "Don't let it spread." "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Turn it off," the voice rasped. Before it's too late, the line went dead, and the studio lights flickered violently. The equipment buzzed, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the room. Then the broadcast abruptly cut out. The next morning, I quit my job. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, but I knew I couldn't go back. A few weeks later, I learned that the station had shut down. According to the news, several listeners had reported hearing strange sounds during the broadcast's whispers, static, even screams. To this day, I don't know what was really happening at WXKR, but sometimes, late at night, I'll turn on the radio and swear I hear faint voices in the static, calling out for help. Just when you think it couldn't get scarier, it does. It started in the summer of 1995, after my grandmother passed away. I was 27 and working a desk job in Boston when I got the call. I'd inherited her bed and breakfast in a small, sleepy town in Maine. It was the last thing I wanted. The idea of leaving my city life to manage some creaky old house for tourists wasn't appealing. But when I visited to settle the estate, something about the place drew me in. The house itself was gorgeous, a sprawling Victorian mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It had that New England charm, with wraparound porches and gabled roofs. It smelled of lemon polish and freshly baked bread, the way I remembered from childhood visits. Nostalgia got the better of me, and before I knew it, I decided to stay. Business wasn't booming, but a steady trickle of travelers kept the place alive. Most were couples on weekend getaways, retirees on road trips, or the occasional backpacker exploring Maine's coast. One night, about 3 weeks after I moved in, a young couple checked out earlier than planned. When I asked why, the man hesitated, glancing at his wife. "We just didn't sleep well," he said. I pressed, curious. "Well, I had this weird dream. It felt like I couldn't move, and someone was in the room. His wife chimed in, looking pale. I saw something too, a shadow, near the closet. I laughed it off, blaming it on the creaks and groans of an old house. But they weren't the last guests to mention it. Over the next few weeks, similar complaints came from others. A businessman swore he heard whispering outside his door. An older woman claimed she felt someone sit on the edge of her bed. I started to feel uneasy myself. Late at night, while I worked in the kitchen or folded laundry, I'd hear faint noises upstairs, footsteps, doors softly closing. But whenever I went to check, the hallways were empty. One rainy afternoon, I was cleaning out the pantry when I found a leather-bound book wedged behind a shelf. It was my grandmother's recipe book, filled with her spidery handwriting. Most of the recipes were ordinary clam chowder. Blueberry peabut, a few stood out. They called for strange ingredients like essence of marrow or tender heart. At first, I thought they were just old-fashioned names for spices or cuts of meat. But the more I read, the more unsettling it became. One recipe, titled Traveler's Delight, included a step to bleed the meat thoroughly and instructions for making a glaze with the juices. I slammed the book shut, my stomach churning. My curiosity got the better of me. That evening, I went up to the attic, where my grandmother had kept old records. Among the dusty boxes, I found guest logs dating back to the 1920s. As I flipped through them, a pattern emerged. Every few months, there was a guest who had checked in, but never checked out. Their names would appear in the log, but there were no charges, no follow-up notes. I began to wonder if the stories my guests had told meant a sleep paralysis. The shadows were connected. But how? One night, while replacing a broken floorboard in one of the guest rooms, I found a hollow space underneath. Curious, I pried it open and discovered a narrow crawl space leading into the walls. I crawled in, flashlight in hand, and quickly realized the passages ran throughout the entire house. Peepholes were drilled into the guest rooms, and in some places, there were small platforms where someone could crouch and watch. I felt sick. Had my grandmother used these to spy on guests, or worse? Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to explore the locked cellar door that I'd ignored since moving in. Using a crowbar, I pried it open and descended into the cold, damp darkness. What I found made my blood run cold. The room was massive, with meat hooks dangling from the ceiling and butcher's tools neatly arranged on a table. There was a drain in the center of the floor, stained dark. In the corner, a chest freezer hummed softly. Inside were vacuum-sealed packages of meat, neatly labeled Tom, Jane, Backpacker. I stumbled back, my head spinning. Panicking, I called the local sheriff. He arrived within minutes, his face calm but serious as I showed him the freezer. When I finished explaining, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You should have left it alone, Mary." Before I could react, he pulled out his gun. I woke up tied to one of the chairs in the basement, the sheriff pacing in front of me. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't just a house, it's tradition. Your grandmother started this to survive the Depression. The town depends on it now." I stared at him in disbelief. "Why do you think everyone loved her cooking?" Before he could say more, a shuffling noise came from the shadows. And then I saw her, my grandmother. Thin, pale, and hunched, but very much alive. She shuffled toward me, her milky eyes locked on mine. "Family stays together," she whispered. I don't remember how I escaped. The next thing I knew, I was driving south, the mansion shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back. The house was sold at auction, and I changed my name. But sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night. Sure, I can hear footsteps outside my door. I've told myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know they're still out there. That was only the beginning. The real terror starts now. I've always believed that a photo can capture more than just an image. It freezes a moment, a memory, a feeling. But in 1952, I learned something else. E-photo can capture something that should have stayed hidden. My name is Thomas Bennett. I'm a photographer. At least, I was one. Back then, I ran a modest studio in a small town in Connecticut. Business wasn't exactly booming, but it was steady enough to keep my wife Eleanor and me afloat. Or at least, it had been until she passed away. Eleanor was everything to me. She kept my chaotic perfectionism in check and managed the business side of things so I could focus on my craft. Without her, the studio felt hollow, like a lens out of focus. My grief made it hard to keep clients, and my once reliable bookings dwindled to almost nothing. By the summer of 1952, I was down to shooting a few weddings here and there, just enough to scrape by. It was a blisteringly hot day in July when I got the call from the Fosters, a wealthy family from the next town over. Their daughter, Margaret, was getting married, and their original photographer had backed out last minute. They needed someone immediately. I almost said now Eddings weren't my favorite, but something about their desperation and the promise of a generous fee made me agree. The wedding was beautiful, held in the garden of their sprawling estate. The ceremony went smoothly, and I captured the usual: the bride's glowing smile, the nervous groom, the proud parents. It was only later, when I was developing the photos in my darkroom, that I noticed something strange. In one of the group shots, just behind Margaret, there was a a man in a dark suit. He wasn't smiling, wasn't looking at the camera. In fact, he looked sad. I didn't remember seeing him at the wedding. He wasn't one of the groomsmen, and his somber expression stood out against the joy of the other guests. At first, I thought it was a double exposure or some mistake in the developing process. But the more I looked at him, the more unsettling he became. His features were sharp, his eyes hollow, and his face had a pale, almost translucent quality. Curious, I showed the photo to the bride when I delivered the prints. Her reaction chilled me to the bone. "That's my father," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "He died last year." Word spread quickly. The Fosters told their friends, and within weeks, I was flooded with requests. Everyone wanted to know if I could capture their lost loved ones. At first, I tried to turn them away. I wasn't a spiritualist, and I didn't want to exploit people's grief, but my failing business made it hard to refuse. Wedding after wedding, the same thing happened. Somewhere in the photos, a shadowy figure would appear. Sometimes it was subtle, like a faint outline in the background. Other times, the deceased stood clear as day, as if they'd been alive and laughing alongside the guests. People started calling my work artistic and otherworldly. They came from all over, desperate for a glimpse of someone they'd lost. The money was good, better than I'd ever made before, but something about the whole thing made my skin crawl. It wasn't long before things got worse. One evening, I was in my darkroom, developing photos from a wedding I'd shot the previous weekend. The familiar acrid smell of chemicals filled the air, and I worked methodically, hanging each photo on the drying line. But then, I saw her. Eleanor. She was in the background of one of the photos, standing among the guests, her favorite summer dress swaying in a non-existent breeze. I dropped the photo. She was gone. For hours, I stared at the drying prints, waiting for her to reappear. But no matter how many times I blinked, her image stayed burned into my mind rather than on the paper. After that, the dead stopped limiting themselves to weddings. They began showing up in every photo I took: family portraits, school pictures, even random shots of the town square. Faces I didn't recognize stared back at me, hollow-eyed and silent, as if they were waiting for something. Then the deaths began. It started with Margaret's wedding. 2 months after her big day, she and her husband were killed in a car accident. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then another couple I'd photographed drowned during their honeymoon, and another. By the time I realized the pattern, 6 of the couples I'd worked with were dead. Desperate for answers, I examined my camera's sturdy Rolleiflex that Eleanor had gifted me years ago. Nothing seemed unusual about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was at the center of everything. The last wedding I shot was for a young couple named Alice and Peter. They were kind, full of hope, and I dreaded what might happen to them. As I framed the final shot of the evening, the happy couple surrounded by their guests, I felt a sudden chill, like a gust of cold air had swept through the room. My hands shook as I clicked the shutter, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard Eleanor's voice whispering my name. When I developed the photos that night, I wasn't surprised to see her. She wasn't in the background this time. She was standing directly behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her eyes met mine, and though her lips didn't move, I knew what she was saying. It's time. That was the last photo I ever took. I smashed the camera the next morning, but it didn't bring me peace. I don't know if it was cursed, or if it somehow tapped into something beyond our understanding. All I know is that the faces of the dead still haunt my dreams, in my waking moments, even in the reflection of my mirrors. I sold the studio and moved away, hoping to leave the horrors behind. But some nights, when the world is quiet, I still hear the faint click of a shutter and feel a hand on my shoulder, cold as the grave. They're waiting for me. And I think, soon, I'll have to join them. You survived that tale, but can you handle this next one? It was the summer of 1961 when I got the job at Minter's Meat Shop in Willow Hollow, Pennsylvania. I was 19, fresh out of high school, and eager to prove myself. Everyone in town knew Minter's was the place to get the best cuts. Folks said old Mr. Arthur Minter had a way with meat, something about his skill that made everything taste better. I figured working there was my chance to learn a trade and maybe save up for college. The shop was small and unassuming, with a red and white striped awning that flapped in the breeze. Inside, the air was always cold, and the smell of raw meat clung to everything. Mr. Minter was a wiry man in his 60s, with hands that looked too big for his thin arms. He didn't say much when I showed up on my first day, just handed me a blood-stained apron and told me to keep the knives sharp. For the first couple of weeks, the work was straightforward: slicing steaks, grinding hamburger, cleaning up after closing. The hours were long, and I was always dead tired when I got home. But I didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the rhythm of the work, the way the blade moved cleanly through the meat. Then I started noticing things. It began with the cold storage. Every night before we left, I'd help Mr. Minter load the shelves with fresh cuts for the next day. Steaks, chops, roasts, it all went into the cooler. But by morning, no matter how much we stocked, the shelves were overflowing again. I asked Mr. Minter about it once, and he just shrugged. "Must have stocked more than you thought," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I knew he was lying. I'd counted those shelves myself. The second thing was the animals, or rather, the lack of them. Every butcher shop I'd ever been to had live animals delivered: cows, pigs, chickens. But at Minter's, the meat arrived already butchered, packed neatly in crates. What's more, it was always warm. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. After Mr. Minter left, I stayed behind and pried open one of the crates. Inside were massive cuts of meat, glistening and red. The smell hit me first, not the metallic tang of raw beef, but something sweeter, heavier. I didn't recognize it, but it turned my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Maybe the long hours were messing with me. But then I found the ledger. It was hidden in the back office, tucked behind a stack of old newspapers. At first glance, it looked like a list of sales names, dates, and cuts of meat. But as I flipped through the pages, something didn't add up. The names weren't just customers. They were people from town. And the cuts? They weren't labeled as beef or pork. Just initials: HB, RL, MT. I froze when I got to the most recent entry. Michael Hayes, 3 months. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the names from the ledger, remembering faces that had disappeared from town without a word. Previous apprentices, Mr. Minter had called them. The next day, I confronted him. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, slamming the ledger onto the counter. Mr. Minter didn't even flinch. He just looked at me with those cold, gray eyes. "You've been doing good work, Michael," he said. "Better than the others. I think you've got what it takes to stay." "Stay?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "As the next butcher," he said. He led me to the cold storage and opened the door. Inside, the shelves were empty, except for a single slab of meat hanging from a hook. As I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a slab of meat at all. It was a torso. Human. I stumbled back, but Mr. Minter grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron. "This town's been fed for generations," he said. "You think they don't know? They don't care where it comes from, as long as the meat keeps coming." I tried to pull away, but he held me fast. "You've got two choices," he said. "Take the apron or take the hook." I don't remember how I got out of there. My legs moved on their own, carrying me out into the night. I ran until my lungs burned, until the lights of the shop were nothing but a memory. I never went back to Minter's. A week later, the shop was closed, the windows boarded up. No one in town seemed to know or care what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum of a freezer and smell that sickly sweet scent. And I wonder if the town still has its butcher, or if it's still being fed. Think you're safe? The shadows are only getting closer. I've been tuning pianos for over 30 years. It's not glamorous work, but it suits me fine. There's something peaceful about the rhythm of it tightening the pins, listening for the harmonics to fall into place, bringing chaos back into order. I've worked on pianos in family homes, schools, churches, and theaters all over New England. Each piano has its own story, its own soul, if you believe in that kind of thing. I didn't, not back then anyway. This story happened in the summer of 1968. I was 56, still spry, but old enough to know better than to ignore the strange feeling I had when I first got the call. It was the manager of the Hartford Grand Concert Hall. The place was famous for its Historia cornerstone of the arts since the late 1800s. Musicians spoke about the acoustics like they were something holy. But the piano? That was something else entirely. "It's the Steinway," the manager said, his voice tight. "The Model D we keep on the main stage. It's not right." "Not right how?" I asked. "It won't stay tuned." "You're the best in the area, Crawford. Can you take a look?" Of course I said yes. A piano like that is a dream for someone in my line of work. The Hartford Grand Steinway was a legend, handcrafted in 1872, rumored to have been played by Liszt himself. I figured it would be an honor. I should have asked why they didn't call sooner. The hall was empty when I arrived. The manager, a wiry man named Egan, met me at the stage door. He didn't look me in the eye as he handed me the keys. "She's all yours," he muttered before disappearing down a hallway. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. I stepped onto the stage, the wooden boards creaking under my feet. The Steinway stood under a single spotlight, its ebony surface polished to a mirror-like shine. She was beautiful. I set my toolbox down and opened the lid. The faint smell of something musty wafted out, not unusual for an old piano. I played a scale, wincing as the notes wavered and clashed. The tuning was a mess, but that was nothing I couldn't handle. I started with the bass strings, tightening the pins and striking each key with my tuning hammer. The first few notes rang out cleanly. But as I moved up the keyboard, something strange happened. I struck middle C. The sound echoed, pure and true. But then, faintly, I heard another notey, soft, dissonant hum, like a whisper beneath the main tone. I paused, listening. The hall was silent. I struck the key again. This time, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just a hum, it was a melody. Someone was playing. I leaned over the keyboard, pressing my ear closer. The melody was faint, weaving through the air like smoke. It didn't match anything I was playing. At first, I thought it might be some kind of resonance in the hall, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. I stood up, scanning the empty theater. The rows of red velvet seats stared back at me. No one was there. Shaking it off, I went back to work. But the further I tuned, the worse it got. Every note I struck seemed to summon another fragment of that ghostly melody. By the time I reached the high notes, the melody was full-fledged eerie, discordant, and impossible to ignore. I closed the lid and stepped back, my heart pounding. And then, the keys moved. At first, it was just one E and A flat, played softly. Then another and another. Soon the piano was playing itself, the melody spilling out in a frantic, chaotic rush. It sounded like a symphony gone mad, notes colliding in a way that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my legs hitting a chair. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty hall. The piano fell silent. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm. I approached the Steinway again, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just mechanics, maybe a stuck hammer or a draft moving the strings. But when I opened the lid, I saw it. The inside of the piano wasn't wood and metal. The strings were sinew, stretched taut over yellowed bone. The hammers weren't felt but something softer, something that looked disturbingly like flesh. I slammed the lid shut, bile rising in my throat. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the piano was holding me there, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. My eyes darted to my toolbox, my only tether to reality. And then I noticed something carved into the side of the piano, just below the keys. A name, Josephine Baird. I'd heard that name before. She was a young pianist who had performed at the Hartford Grand in 1902. She vanished after her debut, leaving nothing behind but rumors and whispers. The keys began to move again, slower this time. The melody was mournful, almost pleading. I realized it wasn't just Plainjet was telling a story. I saw flashes in my mind. Josephine at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys. A man behind her, his face twisted with rage. Blood on the strings. The melody swelled, a crescendo of pain and desperation. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, vibrating through my bones. The piano wanted something. No, it needed something. I could feel its hunger, its demand to be played. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the Steinway. Eventually, the melody stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I gathered my tools and ran, leaving the keys untouched. The next day, I called Egan and told him I couldn't finish the job. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "Every tuner we've brought in has either quit or worse." "Then why keep it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's part of the hall's history," he replied. "And some histories can't be rewritten." I never went back to the Hartford Grand. A few months later, I heard the hall had been closed for renovations. I don't know if the Steinway is still there or if they've hidden it away, but sometimes I hear that melody in my dreams. It always ends the same way, with a single note hanging in the air, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to finish the symphony. Would you? If you thought the last story was bad, wait until you hear what happened next. My name is Dorothy Reynolds. I've been the head librarian at the Green Ridge University Research Library for over a decade. Books have always been my life. Some people find peace in the chaos of a bustling city or the hum of nature. For me, it's the soft rustle of pages, the faint smell of aged paper, and the orderliness of neatly cataloged volumes. Everything in its place, everything accounted for. The library, built in 1908, was a labyrinth of towering shelves and dim corners. It had a reputation for being one of the most comprehensive collections in the state, but also for being peculiar. Students whispered about strange things happening after hours, shadows darting between stacks, books falling without explanation, and the occasional tale of someone getting lost in the maze-like rows. I dismissed these stories as nonsense. Libraries are inherently quiet, and a bit eerie. It's easy to let your imagination run wild. It started subtly. Late one evening, as I was finishing up my usual post-closing routine, I noticed a shelf in the history section was out of order. I prided myself on my organizational skills. The idea of misplaced books was like a splinter under my skin. I pulled out my index cards to cross-check the catalog. But when I compared the books to the records, something didn't add up. Several titles were missing, and others were out of place entirely. I assumed a careless student had done this and sighed. It wasn't unusual for someone to rush through their research and misplace things. I reshelved everything and locked up. But when I returned the next morning, the same section was in disarray, different titles. Same chaos. A week passed, and the disturbances grew more noticeable. One afternoon, a sophomore named Bethany approached the desk. She wanted to check out an old leather-bound volume called The Shadows of Antiquity. It was a dusty tome that no one had touched in years. I scanned her library card and handed her the book. 2 days later, her roommate came to the library, looking for her. She said she was coming here to study, but she hasn't been back to the dorm, the girl said, her voice trembling. Bethany never returned. At first, I chalked it up to a college student's penchant for disappearing for a while, parties, a new boyfriend, whatever. But then it happened again. Another student checked out the Whispering Vaults and vanished the following week. The police were involved by then, but they found nothing. No one connected the disappearances to the library, but I started to feel a gnawing unease. It was a quiet Tuesday night when I first noticed the change in the card catalog. I was reorganizing the drawer for the occult section when I spotted a card that didn't belong. The title read, Thomas Grayson, 1973. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, a misfiled card. But Thomas Grayson wasn't a book. He was one of the students who had disappeared. I stared at the card for a long time, heart pounding. Someone was playing a cruel prank, I decided. I placed the card on my desk, intending to show it to campus security the next morning. By the time I returned to my office, the card was gone. A month later, I worked late cataloging a shipment of new acquisitions. The library was empty, except for me, or so I thought. I heard faint footsteps echoing through the stacks. Hello? I called out. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and I felt a tingling at the back of my neck. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the rows of shelves. The layout of the library had always been a perfect map in my mind. I could navigate it blindfolded. But that night, everything seemed wrong. Shelves twisted into unfamiliar patterns. Hallways that should have led to the exit looped back on themselves. Panic set in when I realized I'd been walking in circles for over an hour. The flashlight began to flicker, and I swore I heard whispers coming from the dark corners of the room. It was during one of these endless nights that I discovered the truth. Deep in the basement, behind a false wall in the archives, I found an ancient manuscript. It detailed a ritual that bound the library to the University of Pact, made long before I was born. The library, it seemed, was alive. It thrived on knowledge, but also required something darker. Sacrifices. The books that rearranged themselves, the vanishing students, the predictive catalog card set, all connected. The library demanded these things to maintain its power. I was faced with an impossible decision. The manuscript outlined 2 paths. I could feed the library by continuing to allow it to claim victims, or I could destroy the collection, severing the pact but losing the library forever. Burning the books felt like destroying a part of myself, but living with the knowledge that I was complicit in something so monstrous was unbearable. I made my choice. The next morning, the library stood as it always had, silent, towering, and full of secrets. I resigned my position and left Greenridge University. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the stacks. I hear the whispers and see the shifting rows, and I wonder, did I really escape? Or did the library let me go because it knew I'd spread its story? All I know is this: if you ever find yourself in a library that feels too quiet, too vast, too alive, leave. Don't look back. Some books aren't meant to be read,